Our first speaker tonight, Justin Ling. As parliamentary correspondent for Vice News, Justin's beat includes national security, intelligence, privacy, foreign affairs, war, justice, and when politicians screw up. He's a busy guy. Born and raised in Cape Breton, he's migrated westward over the years to cover politics for BBC, the National Post, The Guardian, the Globe and Mail, Maclean's Foreign Policy, and an ungodly amount of other outlets. Please welcome Justin Ling.
Hey there, how's it going? If you're playing the drinking game home on Facebook, you can drink anytime I say Breitbart, or talk about my time covering Stephen Harper and how difficult that was. So, I was thinking about this earlier. I was thinking, I was trying to think what my thesis was, what the point of this whole talk was. What the takeaway is, what you can expect for the next 4 years, what we have to do for the next 4 years, what the media has to think about, what journalists have to consider over the next 4 years or 8 years or 6 months or, the way things are going, who knows how long it will actually be. It could be 20 years. Yeah, let that sink in. And I realized I don't have one, and that's kind of a problem, and I think that's kind of the problem. And actually, I would say anyone who tells you that they have the answer to what we're facing right now is probably lying to you, and you should not buy their monorail. Nobody has the answer for what's going on right now, and I think we have to think long and hard about how we got here and try to extrapolate that into figuring out how we have to deal with the things that come up as they come up. But I think there's no real one answer or one solution or one strategy or one technique that's going to kind of give us the pathway to figuring out how to deal with covering a government and an administration and a president that just seems so different and atypical and kind of scary in a lot of ways, whether you agree with them or whether you don't agree with them. Someone who represents something that is completely different than a lot of things we've dealt with thus far. In other ways is similar, but in a lot of ways is very different. And I think we have to kind of sit back and kind of look back at how we got here. We have to consider what's the same, what's different, what's similar, what's extremely unpleasant to think about. And I think it's only until we get to that point where we can actually start figuring out how to cover a government. So, a little bit about me. I, spent the last 7-8 years covering politics all across the country, from here in Montreal to Ottawa, now in Toronto. I've, traveled all throughout North America, kind of doing stories, DC, Toronto, Ottawa, and I spent 3 years covering the Harper government. And if you know anything about the Harper government, it was not an easy government to cover in a lot of ways. It's a government that, not unlike Mr. Trump, took every opportunity it could to bash the media, to belittle the work of journalists, to try to frustrate access and accountability and openness and transparency and media access. And I think there's a whole bunch of lessons we can take from that government and the way that government treated us, and use it and apply to how the Trump government is about to maybe try to manhandle the White House press and the press more broadly in America. But I think first off, we gotta have to figure out how America elected a guy that just seems so insanely and incredibly unelectable in a lot of ways. And I think there's a lot of answers to it. There's not just one answer. It's not as simple as saying, the press did too much coverage of Hillary Clinton's email server, or, America was just brought in by fake news, or, just the Russians were involved. It's not one thing. It really is a confluence, a perfect storm, a train crash of 8 different cars all kind of meeting at the same juncture and winding up in this insanely unlikely, improbable, kind of unthinkable, unfathomable reality where, we're about to make America great again. It seems so unlikely that we would get here, but I think trying to blame one thing is a bit of delusion, right? I mean, yes, the Kremlin almost undoubtedly hacked DNC email servers and used WikiLeaks to run a smear campaign against Hillary Clinton, to which the media played a large part in propagating it and creating a situation where the Democratic nominee got totally maligned, and maybe in such a way that she did not deserve or that should not have been covered in that way. That's definitely true. That's probably not what got Trump elected. I mean, you have to talk about the fact that there is a white working class in America. Yeah, that's a real map. You have to really think about that for a second. The white working class in America has been left behind over the past 15, 20 years, and they simply didn't believe a lot of the message that Hillary Clinton was trying to sell. I mean, there is a group of people in America that have just gotten so frustrated with the status quo that they were willing to take anything that fell outside of it. And they were willing to take anything that promised them something different and willing to believe anyone who told them that they were going to tear down the system. I mean, there's a meme going around on the internet. I actually wish I included some of them, where it's just different iterations of people saying Bernie would have won. But it's probably true. Bernie Sanders may well have beat Donald Trump, as insane of a matchup as that sounds. So I think it's, we have to think about the fact that there's a whole bunch of problems in America and in Canada and in France and in the UK and everywhere in the world where there is a dissatisfied underclass and upper class in a lot of ways that we have to look at and talk to and think about when we're, covering the news and we're thinking about politics. But, the media is what I'm here to talk about. That's what I'm really here to focus on. And, the alienation and the undercutting of media is not a new thing. This is actually a real photo that a lot of reporters were pretty upset about during the campaign. Hillary Clinton's staffers had actually created a rope line to rope in journalists as she went to meet average voters and brought them around like a pen whenever she went to shake hands with the public. And you have to really sit and think about that, where we get to the point in a country, in any country, where any Western country that is relatively developed and has a rule of law and responsible media and all of that, where you actually have paid political staffers like herding around journalists as though they're sheep. You've really fucked something up really badly to get to that spot. And I can tell you, under the Harper government, we learned a lot of things about how to push back and how to deal with political flacks who thought that they had this legitimacy to kind of constrain the free press. And I think it's a lot of these situations where we kind of have some instruction on how to deal with a government that is really reticent to having a free press followed around. We had situations where Stephen Harper would hold a press conference every 6 months. And what they would do is that they would try to create a list of who they wanted to ask questions. So there'd be 5 questions from 5 different journalists, and you would kind of beg and plead with a communications staffer saying, "Can I get on the list to ask a question?" And the communications staffer would go, "Well, let me think about it. What do you want to ask about? Oh, you want to ask about that? Yeah, well, we'll think about it." And then suddenly there would be a magical list devised of 5 journalists who, in a lot of cases, would be more or less friendly, or at least be asking friendlier questions to the prime minister. And you actually got a situation where media flacks would be able to determine exactly what the prime minister gets asked in a seemingly open press environment. Luckily, journalists fought back against that, and they started saying, if you insist on having this list, we're not going to show up. You can have a press conference with nobody there, and you can have a lot of fun with yourself, but if you want us to come and cover you, we get to ask the questions. You don't get to pick and choose them. And it worked. They backed down. The alternative was that they just had less press conferences and had less questions to ask. So that was another thing. So, then there was a push by the Harper government to say you could come and you could cover a press conference, but you couldn't have any reporters there. You could bring television cameras in, but nobody could ask any questions, which also not a great solution. It actually stayed that way for a long time in Ottawa, up until kind of the last election, when a couple of us, over the years, myself included, started either writing stories about how the prime minister wouldn't take questions, or you started yelling questions at him during events, or you were willing to just kind of be a jerk about it. And that's kind of where we got to, where you had to turn the fact that they were not staying accountable to the press into a news story. And that actually worked in a lot of different ways. But there's also situations where, the government is so antithetical and so hostile to the press that you get to a Richard Nixon-like situation. And we kind of, always step back from the line of this in Canada, which is lucky. This is an actual real anecdote from a book about Nixon's time in office, where he'd openly discussed poisoning another journalist with LSD on a steering wheel, in an attempt to try to get him to have some sort of psychedelic car accident, which is novel, I guess. But and this is the thing, is that when you have a government that almost exists in antithesis of the media, where there's no cooperation, there's no understanding, there's no divide, there's no kind of bridge between you two, can get really toxic and can get really dangerous. Which is why you need to be aware of people like this. And I think we may have actually had too little focus on how bad both candidates were in the last general election in the United States. How bad they were with the media. I mean, Hillary Clinton has had a long-standing disdain for the media going back to her times as First Lady of the White House. She originally had tried to ban a whole raft of journalists from the White House and try to restrict their access in the White House itself. Donald Trump virtually had no access to the roaming press corps while a candidate. He rarely did real press conferences. There's actually a video of a Trump press officer hitting another journalist. This isn't normal. This is bad. And when you let candidates go this far, attacking the press so openly, you get to crazy Richard Nixon threatening to murder journalists with psychedelic drugs. And I think journalists get very skittish about reporting on politicians who are that threatening or who are that afraid of the press. And I think we have to be more willing to talk about this, and more willing to talk about politicians who do hate the press. And I think if we don't, there's a real chance we're going to start electing more nut jobs who are trying to kill us. But that being said, there was a lot of good reporting in this last election. And this goes both for the American election and the last Canadian one, where you did have journalists doing real financial reporting, digging through tax returns, dealing with confidential sources, dealing with anonymous sources who were kind of blowing the whistle on certain shady practices in the Trump organization, in the Clinton Foundation. You did have real muckrakers who were going out there and who were really trying to get to the bottom of a story. And so I'm talking a bit of how politicians go after the media. There is nevertheless still journalists out there who are willing to kind of needle and poke politicians in power and get the story out that really matters. Get out the fact that during the last 15, 20 years, Donald Trump frequently wrote checks from his own organization to pay off lawsuits, to buy himself art. At one point, Donald Trump used money from his charitable foundation to buy a portrait of himself, which is, I don't think, covered enough, and that's the last election, which is like so mind-numbingly bizarre. And then we get to the situation of, quote-unquote fake news. And I think this really strikes to the heart of this second large problem. So we have the problem of politicians not trusting the media, hating the media, and the media not doing a good enough job of kind of challenging them on it and kind of underlining our role as an important, critical part of the democratic ecosystem. But there's a bigger problem, which is that people don't fucking trust us. And it's a real problem. People don't trust their elected representatives. People don't trust the news media. People don't trust TV, newspapers. And it's getting to be a real problem. And we saw this culminate in this really unsettling way in this election under the guise of fake news. Now, some fake news were, bored. Some of it was bored teenagers sitting in, Nebraska or Eastern Europe, just making up stories and posting them on Facebook to get views and likes so they could earn advertising revenue. Some of it was literally Russian intelligence agents or Russian press officers just adding things to the ecosystem just to confuse people. Some of it was just deliberate lying by the campaigns. But what it ended up doing was just kind of exacerbating and highlighting this issue where there's just information out there that we're not verifying accurately, that people are trusting blindly, or that is kind of diluting and sort of, I guess, it's hard to even put into words, that it's kind of adding to this distrust and this dismay at the general news media, and we don't know how to fix it yet. And it's a real problem. But there is one thing we can fix, which is the fact that there is fake news and there's things that people are calling fake news that is not. And this is a thing you've seen the Trump White House do already. And believe me, the phrase Trump White House is still really hard to really wrap your head around. But, you know, there is people out there saying fake news this, fake news that. You saw Donald Trump call CNN and BuzzFeed News fake news in a way that he's just, and the way in which he's discrediting the press by calling them fake news is something we really have to be afraid of. I mean, it's really unusual to see an elected official going after a legitimate news source who is reporting the news. And there's a, you know, the Barack Obama did that a little bit to Fox News, somewhat deservedly, somewhat not. But to see him go after CNN as fake news is really terrifying, and I think we all have to be kind of on our toes and make sure that no one ever accepts that as a normal thing to do. But you know, over here there's a really scary thing. One of them is just people making up news for a laugh. One of them is conspiracy sites who have somehow gotten mainstream in the last 6 months, like Alex Jones's InfoWars, which is a 9/11 conspiracy site, a site that suggests that the Sandy Hook massacre never happened, a site that tells you that if you buy his super male virality pills that you will be a super uber man and never die. I mean, this site is full of crazy things, and Donald Trump did an interview with them during the campaign. I mean, he literally spoke to them in an official interview. You know, Breitbart is another kind of less bad news site in this ecosystem. There's a whole bunch of them. And that's terrifying that they're actually getting legitimacy and they're getting the same sort of reads and likes and shares as legitimate news, and the fact that they're clouding this atmosphere. On the other side, you have Russian news that is literally just made up stuff that is advancing the cause of the Russian government and that is living side by side with these other, you know, legitimate news sites, and in such a way that the Russian government is just gleefully laughing over. And I think both of those things taken together is leading to just more distrust, more disdain for the media, and I think that's really terrifying. But there's also a problem of the fact that a lot of news out there really sucks right now. And, you know, it's not just CNN. It's definitely CNN, but it's not just CNN. And it started in the 90s with the 24-hour news cycle. It got worse as, you know, TV stations and newspapers started freaking out over the declining of online ad revenue. It got only worse over the last several years with, you know, social news and all of this. And these are all not bad things. You know, 24-hour news networks, great source of information for the most part. Online ad revenue meant a whole bunch of small news sites like Vice and BuzzFeed could crop up. Social news meant, you know, a lot of folks could be reporters from anywhere. But a lot of those things also contributed to just a dismay and a freak out in the corporate media over what to do. And the response for a lot of them was, let's invest less in news, let's report whatever shit pops up online, let's have nothing but pundits show up all day to just spew you know, easily digestible sound bites. Like, you know, the fact that Rudy Giuliani was on any network during this campaign is frankly terrifying. But you know, this is what kind of led to this obsession about the Hillary Clinton email case. Now, listen, there was a lot of good reporting to be done about, you know, how Hillary Clinton dealt with or didn't adequately deal with confidential material. You know, I deal with a lot of intelligence stories. It is a real story. Did it deserve to be covered as much as Donald Trump potentially breaking untold number of laws in both corporate law, education law, sexual harassment law? I mean, you know, are those on the same level? No. And today the corporate media has a real problem with, you know, balance. You know, there is an idea that the balance has to be on the left and right, not on what is relevant, what's newsworthy, what's factual, what's important, but instead on this objective sense of political balance. And we haven't quite figured out how to fix this yet. And unfortunately, I'm not sure the networks are going to really be thinking about this over the next couple of years, which is terrifying. I mean, I think they're still very much in this mode of, we're going to give 5 minutes to the Republicans and 5 minutes to the Democrats. And it doesn't matter if we're spending 5 minutes chasing a dumb story on the Democrats and 5 minutes chasing the biggest story in the world on the Republicans. Balance is important. And this is exactly the problem. I mean, the stark contrast between how much time was spent on Hillary Clinton's email servers or the leaked WikiLeaks emails or what have you is frankly staggering. And I think we didn't see it at the time quite as clearly as we do now. Looking back, it was so disproportionately out of whack that the media really has to sit and look at itself and think, how much did we fuck this up? I mean, just the fact that you're writing stories without any sort of thought or process behind the stories you're picking does not make you a good journalist, does not make you the responsible media. And I think we have to think a lot more about, what the media has to focus on. And some of this has to be the responsibilities of the viewers as well. I mean, when you share a news story, when you click a news story, when you like a news story, when you tweet a news story, that's a vote. You're basically voting with your eyeballs about what you want to see. And news, I like to say the news doesn't, viewership doesn't always dictate news, but it's definitely a big driver. And I think we have to think about that. And I think a lot of people point to this. BuzzFeed last week published, 2 weeks ago now, published a dossier full of allegations that the Trump campaign was basically in bed with the Russians, that he was more or less a Russian intelligence source, and yes, obviously the best part of it, that he paid sex workers to piss on a bed in somewhere in Russia just to spite the Obamas. This, people went after this, and BuzzFeed got called out for this. The Trump administration really hammered at BuzzFeed for this, as well as CNN. But this is the sort of reporting that matters more. It was a risk. It was something that they may have to eat crow for one day. But fundamentally, this sort of reporting is a lot braver and a lot more gutsy and more the work of the free press than just incessantly running interviews with various Trump spokespeople who are just lying on air. There's a lot of media who pretend like they are doing the job to hold the government's feet to the fire, to hold truth to power, whatever the hell that means anymore. And a lot of this is cropping up with the idea of fact-checking. Everyone's a fact-checker now. Everyone's writing fact-check stories. Every time Donald Trump opens his mouth, there's a new fact-check article that comes up. But it's one thing to listen to a soundbite and then check a Wikipedia page and then publish it as a fact-check. It's quite another to invest in investigative journalists. It's quite another to spend time filing access to information, freedom of information requests. It's another to have foreign bureaus. It's another to invest in real good financial reporters. And this is the sort of thing that no one's doing anymore. BuzzFeed is doing it. Vice is doing it. There's a handful of others that are still doing this. But in a lot of ways, media is doing a very good job of putting up the appearances of doing real hard-nosed reporting without doing a lot of the heavy lifting for it. And I think, this obsession with fact-checking is exactly that. I mean, a good fact-check requires a reporter who's, that is their beat. They research this every day. They have sources who deal with this all the time. They have a trove of information and documents behind this. It's not just somebody's, writing up a 200-word piece saying, actually, the crowd size on the National Mall was 100,000 off what he said. Like, that is not useful fact-checking. But we're obsessing over that. And this never ends. There's, in the course of a couple of weeks, the number of fact-check stories that show up is mind-boggling. Sorry, that's a really unflattering screen grab. I grabbed that earlier on today. I wasn't really paying attention. Oh, that's really unflattering. Yeah, and so I kind of touched on this a little bit already, but there's things that we as reporters have to do, and there's things that politicians need to do, and then the public as a whole need to do. But it comes down to the fact that we need to pay for, support, read, and encourage good news. Good news that is thoughtfully written, that is well reported, that is has time taken on it, that requires money, that requires staff, resources, And there's not been enough of this over the last couple of years, and we saw a hilarious dearth of this during the campaign. There was good stories. There weren't enough good stories. And, you know, I wouldn't pretend as though more good reporting would have changed the outcome of the election, but it may have changed the outcome of the candidates. I mean, you know, the quality and the state of American political reporting is one that allows Donald Trump to go and attack the national media. It's one that allows Hillary Clinton to lead around a team of reporters on a rope line. And I think if we don't start augmenting the level of political reporting and start rebuilding trust with the public, we're boned. So that's about, I'll leave you on this like really lovely image. So that's it. You know, it's a thoroughly depressing, sort of sad, dystopian presentation that ends on a Donald Trump and fishnets, but that's about all I have for you, so thanks.
Thanks, Justin.